Hello members, good evening and welcome. My name is Anna Spooner. I am the Tastings and Events Coordinator here at the Wine Society, and I'm delighted to be joined this evening by our buyer for Italy, Sarah Knowles, MW. So good evening, Sarah.
And cheers. Good evening, Anna. How are you? Cheers.
Very well. All the better for having 6 beautiful Italian wines in front of me, to be honest with you. A midweek treat. So thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to tag along. And it really is our pleasure in the tastings team to have Sarah tonight. She is hugely knowledgeable about Italy, has a great breadth and depth of knowledge. And Tim from the tastings team and Sarah worked together to choose a great selection of fine Italian wines from our Italy offer. I know some of you are a bit worried that the wines may have sold out before the end of the tasting, but don't worry, I have it on good authority that they are all still in stock, so that's great news. Some of you will have had the packs, and some of you may have opted to buy the full bottles. If you did choose to buy the packs, a little bit of pre-housekeeping before we get started. It's worth mentioning that the numbers, so wines 1 to 6, are not the order that we'll be tasting in this evening. Now, you should have received an email from Tim. If you haven't, please do feel free to email tastingsexternal@thewinesociety.com, or Tim is going to pop it in the chat, the actual order we're tasting in. Now, I've got them all lined up in the correct order. I am also going to be telling you which wines we're going to be tasting in which order. Sarah has said that she suggests tasting in pairs, but by no means do you need to. If you've got all 6 poured, then lucky you for having 6 matching wine glasses is all I can say. I'm glad there's a bit of depth perception going on here because they are not the same in my house. But if you haven't managed to get 6, then I would encourage you to taste in pairs if you can. And to give you an idea of the wines that we have coming up, the first wine will be number 2 from your sample kit, and the second wine we're going to taste will be number 6. So to reiterate, if you haven't got those 2 wines ready, they're the ones we're going to start with, 2 and 6. And like I said, if you do want to get the email, please feel free to email tastingsexternal@thewinesociety.com. So that's the very logisticy bit done. The other small logistics are, some of you have already started, but please do use the chat to let us know where you are, what you're drinking. And if you're tasting along, we'd love to hear what you think of the wines. I would suggest when you do hit the chat box, make sure you select everyone, because if you only hit tastings and panelists, then it's just Sarah, Tim and I that'll be able to see. We've got Tim behind the scenes tonight and he'll be monitoring it. If you would like to ask a question, and please do, it's not often we have the fountain of knowledge here with us, so please do feel free to ask questions. We might not be able to get through them all, we hope we will, but we'd encourage you to use the Q&A box. The reason is it will be much easier for Tim behind the scenes to filter those questions. So I think that's quite enough from me. As I mentioned, we've got the first 2 wines which are in your sample kit 2 and 6. And if you're tasting along with the bottles, that is the Sicilian wine and then our Barolo. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah. I'm so excited. So Sarah, you can take it away with all things Italy.
Okay. Well, actually, Anna, as we go, I'm going to try and make it very simple and open the wines as we go. So I have number 2. That's the wine we're going to start with. I'm terribly sorry we didn't get the order totally right for the original boxes, but better to correct it in retrospect. And yes, as Anna says, I do think they're going to look good in pairs. So if you have got them together, then that's going to be lovely. So the first 2, the Etna followed by the Barolo. I think some people will feel that it's a bit odd to hit the Barolo second wine of the event, but hopefully my logic will hold up as we taste through. Oh, cheers. It's lovely to have something in the glass at last. So Etna, or perhaps Sicily. So Sicily has been a huge discovery for me over the last few years. I think I've visited Sicily as frequently as I have visited Piedmont and Tuscany, the 2 sort of classic fine wine regions for Italy, since taking on Italy for the Wine Society, which I only did 3.5 years ago, I guess. And of course, 2 of those years, lockdown. But Sicily just has a huge amount of promise for so many different wines, but I think at the fine wine end especially. And that promise is not just because it has some fantastic vineyards that are very special and very particular, but it's also because it has a real energy and people at the moment. And the sort of winemaking community is really buzzing. So every time I'm there, I'm hearing of new people and new things that are going on. So those of you that have watched some of the recent Italian cooking and wine presentations and shows will have seen that they went to Sicily. We know that lots of producers are getting some airtime. It's a very kind of cool place to be right now. And I think it's for lots of different reasons. And some of that, interestingly, might be because of climate change as well. So because Sicily is so south and has always experienced such warm temperatures during the summer, actually the current trend for increased temperatures could be argued to be having slightly less effect and impact because the grapes are already quite hardy and used to these very hot temperatures. And so a lot of the indigenous grape varieties that you're finding grown across Sicily and really cope well with heat and with stress and with low levels of water. We're looking at a wine that is new to our range, and I really tasted these wines only probably for the first time during lockdown, and then I tasted a couple of different vintages and decided that for this offer I would really keen to get one in. And it's from an Etna vineyard. This is actually made by a Spanish winemaker, or at least he's from Tenerife. Eduardo, first went out to Sicily in 2012, and he really sort of fell in love. He's come from a volcanic winemaking background in Tenerife. His father had some vines, and he's now come into Sicily and found this magical volcano. Etna is the most active volcano in Europe, and he started out working with a couple of vineyards in Vitoria and fell in love with the island more generally. And he's now been there since 2012, and he's really committed to the winemaking project he's doing. And one of his biggest things is organics. And of course, the wonderful warm weather in Sicily means that organics is also a little bit easier than it is elsewhere, mainly because disease pressure is down. So despite these grapes being quite thin-skinned, you'll see that there's not a huge amount of intense color. You can definitely see the top of your stem through the glass. So it isn't by any means opaque. Nerello Mascalese, which is the main grape variety in here, has quite a light color and can be quite prone to disease, but in somewhere like Sicily, where there is such beautiful weather and very little fog and dampness that would be a problem for thin-skinned grape varieties that we often hear about when talking about Pinot, for example. Grown in northerly France means that there's often a little bit more fog. But here, it's a lovely, clean, fresh grape variety that produces lighter colored, fresh red wines. So Edo has about 4.7 hectares now. He owns about half of that, but he is leasing some of the other plots. And those hectares are spread across 9 different vineyards in Etna. It's really tricky because Etna has sort of had an ancient history of wine growing since the Romans. And actually in the sort of middle of the 19th century, there are about 52,000 hectares planted to vines over the sort of surrounding areas and around the mountain. Now, despite a resurgence of interest in Etna in the last 20 years, it's actually only about 3,000 hectares in total planted. So there's a long way to go, but some of the remaining and surviving vineyards on Etna are some of the older sites. And so there is an opportunity for younger winemakers to come new to Etna and buy these beautiful old vineyards, or to start working with beautiful old vineyards. And Edo has definitely spent a lot of time in these vineyards. You can see here lots of straw on the ground. It's because he's working with organic production. And of course, interestingly, organics in Sicily looks different to organics in more northerly, perhaps wetter areas, because you can't necessarily have cover crops. They may look beautiful and they may add to the biodiversity, but in the middle of the summer with little rain and very high temperatures, cover crops are going to take away from your vines rather than add to your biodiversity and to your organic matter. So here he's making the Nerello in a very quite modern style, but a very sympathetic style. So he's not using a lot of bells and whistles. It's fermented in concrete. and then it goes into very old oak or into cement concrete barrels, and it's aged in those to allow the tannins to really pull together, and then released usually a couple of years after harvest.
It's got such an amazing perfume, Sarah.
Yeah, no, it's I think this grape variety is really often being compared to things like Pinot Noir or Nebbiolo, which we're going to try next. But it's because of that incredibly sort of lifted perfume, very red fruit, rich, floral notes. It's quite an elegant perfume at that. So it's not a sort of hit you around the head, intense, full-on wine. We'll get to one or two of those later. Italy can do it. But this is more about sort of sense of place and energy, quite a light touch for a red fine wine here.
I was going to mention that. I mean, Nerolo Mascalese, it's one of those great varieties that 5 years ago I'd never heard of, and in the last 5 months I can't stop hearing about. Do you think it's one of those trendy varieties, maybe people moving away ever so slightly from those really, like you say, blockbuster Italians and looking for something kind of with some elegance, finesse, lighter styles, summer drinking, dare I say?
I think there's definitely been a trend for a more modern style of red wine. So something that's approachable a little younger, that doesn't necessarily need so many years before it's in balance, but also something that's a little bit dialed back from the kind of full, very vanilla-y, very ripe, very oaky wines that we all loved maybe 10 years ago. And I'm sure that there's a swing to that. So there will be consistent change year in, year out, from, you know, the easiest one to always look at is this sort of, is oak in fashion on Chardonnay or not now? And we sort of swing from one extreme to the other. But most of the time we're somewhere sitting in the middle. The Wine Society has always usually preferred balanced styles, which show slightly less winemaking across lots of different grape varieties. And so the current trend for more modern, slightly fruit-forward, pure wines is quite in line with at least the Wine Society style, which tends to, I think, be a little bit more or less trend-driven over the last at least 30 years or so, looking back at our catalogue. But no, what's interesting here is that there's also use of other grape varieties, including some whites in here. So it's 85% Nerello Mascalese, but then there's also some Nerello Cappuccio and some different white grape varieties, so Catarratto and Grecanico. And I think that slight addition of white varieties, we happened to be talking to Alberto Antonini yesterday from Chianti, and we're seeing it happen there. And I think we're seeing it happen in lots of regions now, where it's permissible within the rules, actually having a few whites in the blend at sort of ferment really helps keep it fresh and bright, adds a little bit more floralness, adds a little bit more lightness.
Fabulous. And just before we move on to the next wine, because I did spot when we went through the lineup, this is the only IGT wine. You've just said rules permitting. This is the only wine, you know, we're almost about to go from one extreme to the other. And IGT, dare I say it, regional, that's not really the right language. And then we're about to taste probably the most famous, very, very tightly regionalized wine in the whole of Italy. So what's the difference here? Is this young producer doing something fun, experimenting?
So there are lots of small factors that stop wines from often being seen as a DOC or a DOCG. So Etna has a DOC registration, or registration is probably the wrong word, has a DOC recognition. But oddly, Sicily doesn't seem to have enough DOCGs. So there's only one DOCG on Sicily, Cespolo di Vittoria, which is one of the older producing regions, but it does feel like Etna is catching up, and there might be a DOCG in the pipework, at some point soon. But there are lots of reasons, as I say, that sometimes wines can fall out. And we saw it especially in Chianti as people made IGT wines because they wanted to be able to focus on vineyards that perhaps weren't classified, or grape blends that weren't allowed, or single varieties that perhaps weren't allowed, or oak treatments that weren't allowed within the rules. And generally speaking, over time, the regulations either catch up or the trend passes. So we've seen that in Chianti, where Gran Selezione has come into a place which now covers most of the Super Tuscans that were And in here, in this case, I believe it's because at one point Edoardo is making his wines in Vittoria, and to have an Etna DOC, you have to make your wines within Etna. He has actually moved his winery. It moved in 2018. I'd be interested to see whether his 19 is Etna DOC rather than IGT Sicily. But there could be other very minor reasons why it's not being seen as part of the DOC. But it's all a little bit of a, or it can feel like a bit of a mystery, or jumping through hoops at some point in Italian regulations.
I was about to say, one of the reasons to love Italy, though, you can get the finest wines that are IGT wines. So thank you for sharing that, Sarah. I've not tried that before. I love it. Really, absolutely my style of wine for this time of year.
Great. And so then, correct me if I'm wrong, Anna, I think we're going to try number 6.
We are, yeah.
In this order. So number 6, for those of you following along. So we're moving to Barolo, and we're doing this because Etna keeps being compared with Nebbiolo and Barolo. And I'm not sure whether it's a great comparison or just a bit confusing in the way in which this goes. But I thought it would be helpful to try them next to each other, because in lots of ways I can see why the comparison is drawn. So these are, Barolo is an established fine wine region. Etna is perhaps trying to become a very established fine wine region in the last 5 years. It's definitely picked up a huge amount of column inches and is making some very impressive wines, although perhaps the jury's out on how well they age, simply because we haven't had long enough to age them. Barolo, we know, can age, and this is a nice, fully mature example from 2010. But you can see on colour, if you have both glasses, I have 2 in front of me, they're pretty similar, if not identical. So they're both quite light-skinned grape varieties, again, red grapes, and they're both quite perfumed. I think you mentioned it, Anna, on the Etna wine, but the Nebbiolo here, which makes Barolo, is known for being very perfumed. And again, it's that sort of red fruit spectrum. So I often think of wines falling into red or black fruits as a start of the 10 when I first smell a red. And the red fruit count for me would be things like red currants, cranberries, strawberries, cherries, those types of summer fruit berries almost. Black fruit for me would be the sort of more bramble, mulberry, plum, blackcurrant flavors that we get on things like Shiraz or Cabernet. So I think there are some similarities, but we're going to get some differences too. Both have some lovely fresh acidity. I think the first one, that modern style was sort of pushing that crunchiness and freshness. And if we taste the Barolo, we'll see that this also has some bright acidity, but probably a major difference here. So I think tasting this, it's very hard not to notice those tannins. So Nerello Mascalese does have tannins. You would have noticed when you were trying that last wine that perhaps you had a drying sensation in the mouth. They're quite fine though, whereas the Nebbiolo tannins always have a character that is quite noticeable. And even after 12 years, these tannins are noticeably drying of the inside of the mouth, and they grip to your teeth. Although here I think it's incredibly well managed, and of course with 12 years the tannins have started to really integrate and soften. So let me talk a little bit more. Oh, sorry, Anna. Yeah.
No, not at all. I was just going to say it feels kind of richer and more unctuous, whether it's because of those tannins or perhaps how the winemaker has manipulated the wine, which I think is probably something you're about to talk about. I know nothing about this wine, so I'm keen to hear more on it, Sarah. So I'll pass back over to you.
So this is quite a fine. So I guess I went to Piedmont and first tasted these wines 4 years ago, and we were with Sebastian at the time. We went down into quite a sort of low-lying area between vineyards that tend to be up on the hills, and there's an enormous brick-built castle. Is really the way to say it. It's a very modern, but almost taking inspiration from like medieval brickwork style castle. And it's completely a work of art in terms of the craftsmanship gone into the building, and it's quite imposing to approach. But this wonderful winery, as you can see, one of the turrets to the left, and as you go in, the sort of the extent to which this architecture sort of style has been embraced is much more apparent. But it's really the work of a sort of mother and son partnership. So Maurizio Anselmo, who's the current winemaker and the son in this, has sort of inherited this incredible family estate. And they have an amazing number of vineyards across Barolo that his mother is the head viticulturist for. And she is very involved in making sure that the vineyards are of an impeccable standard. And for a very long time, they were selling grape varieties, but also making wine whilst they were building the winery and keeping the wine. And it's only been quite recently that they've started releasing the wine on a commercial scale, so exporting to people like us. And we were able to taste the wines of the 2016 vintage, which is when we started working with them. And we stocked quite a number because the styles of the wines were really wonderful, and I offered them in the En Primeur offer. But of course, knowing that they hadn't released an awful lot of wine prior to then, I've always been asking Maurizio if there was a little key to his cellar door and whether we could have a look at some older vintages. And last year, when I was out in Piedmont, we were able to taste some older wines. And this 2010 from the Mosconi vineyard was one of the wines that really stood out for me in my tasting. And I think is really standing out now. I don't know, sometimes I worry about these little package samples, but I must learn not to, because this is really singing. And I hope it's singing for you guys too, because it's a real classic fine wine. So the Mosconi vineyard is a famous vineyard. It's right in the southern end of the Barolo appellation, and it's in an area called Monforte d'Alba. It's based on a soil type which is common to the sort of, if you were to look at a map of Barolo, to the right-hand side, and it tends to lead to wines that have slightly firmer tannins and slightly longer aging capacity, whereas wines to the sort of left-hand side, producers like Barotto and Verduna, perhaps have a soil type that leads to slightly finer tannins and an approachability in the wine that can often be a little early. However, Mosconi tends to be one of the exceptions, or at least for me. I always get this incredible red apple flavor and very floral or almost herbal note, like black tea or violets, that hopefully are coming through for some of you too. 2010 was a very good vintage. It's quite a classic vintage in that it had quite a cool growing season. There weren't any heat spikes. And it was quite a late harvest for the region. It's a vintage actually that we haven't seen in quite a long time in those styles. We've been having much warmer, riper vintages in the last 3 or 4 years. But hopefully it's really starting to sing now and showing the potential of this grape.
I really liked your tea note, Sarah, because I drink a lot of Earl Grey tea, and I think it has got that kind of, you know, it's tea, but in the more floral sense of tea. That makes sense, that bergamot, all of those things for me. I'm getting masses of that. So yeah, absolutely beautiful. And on that point about the vintage being a slightly cooler one, I thought it might be worth just to mention age and aging of wines. I think, yeah, this is our oldest vintage. Would that cooler vintage be a benefit potentially for the ageability of the wines? Would it have a slight freshness? Would it change how the wines age, I suppose, is what I'd like to say.
So definitely cooler and warmer vintages age differently. I think often, perhaps because I'm very impatient, I see cooler vintages as trickier, because in a region like Piedmont, cooler vintages can often take longer to come round, and because the tannins are a little firmer and the fruit's a little more subtle to start with, and so you're waiting for that tertiary development to really take place. So actually the warmer vintages that we've been having recently will conversely be ready sooner, and will be in balance sooner, because the tannins are riper as they're going into bottle, and they're already a bit more balanced. And the fruit is, of course, much more vibrant in a warmer vintage. And so you're perhaps taking that choice about whether or not to drink it young and it's vibrant and full of fruit, or whether to leave it a little bit longer and see whether the tertiary characters come to the same level. Which of course is, you know, sort of fine wine conundrum, but on lots of different styles of fine wine, not just Barolos. But hopefully tasting wines like this gives a good idea of what will happen over 12 years. Because when we talk about aging Barolo, we can often talk about 20 or 30 years potential, when actually I think 10 years is a really sweet spot. 12 years is looking wonderful on this wine. I think really now with some of the warmer vintages after 5 years, and they're of course released a few years, having been held back at the winery for at least 2 to 3. So actually 5 years and you can start really enjoying these wines, which I think is for those of us who are impatient, perhaps like I am, or simply don't have great cellars in their 4th floor apartments, struggle to age wine beautifully. So it can be very helpful to have wines that open a little sooner.
I love that. My husband's definitely one of the impatient, prefers the younger wine bracket, and yes, we've never twinned it, but I'm sure he probably does prefer those warmer vintages.
Yeah.
Oh, fabulous. I was going to say let's do food pairings after each pair. What do you think, Sarah? Because John Kavanagh made a comment in the chat. I'm conscious of time, so we might have to do some quick ones if that's all right.
No, we're good.
What sort of thing would you like to taste with each?
With these
wines?
So I'm an absolute sucker, and it's going to sound like a hugely snobby choice, but it's really hard to think of tasting and enjoying Barolo without thinking of truffles. This region is famous for them. They're incredibly expensive and they can be a little bit of a Marmite flavor for lots of people. But in Piedmont, they make a wonderful, very thin tagliatelle called Tyrrhene, and they cover it in an enormous amount of velvety butter sauce. And then they grate fresh truffles on top. And if you, anyone on this call, if anyone gets a chance to go to Piedmont, go to Alba or go to any of the sort of regional villages or even the major towns in anywhere through October till February, please do have a bowl of Tyrrhene and truffles and a glass of Nebbiolo, preferably Barolo, and it's a wonderful, wonderful pairing. I think that earthiness comes through. But of course, when we talk of truffles, we can also talk to other good wild mushrooms, mushroom risottos, things like that are a wonderful pairing with Nebbiolo, especially with a little bit more creaminess or the butteriness of the pasta, because those tannins are chunky and you need a little bit of the fat and the protein there to really help soften them out even further. So that would be my go-to pairing with things like Barolo. With Etna, it's trickier because often the wines around Sicily, usually I sort of talk about wines and food going very closely together within subregions in Italy. But actually, I don't think Nerello Mascalese is a great match for seafood, which would be the big Sicilian go-to. Perhaps more of the vegetables, so things like aubergines and so cooked tomato ragus and aubergine flavors. But actually, I think it's going to be better placed with cured meats or with pork sausages or those sorts of flavors. It's definitely going to hold up to a sort of mid-weight protein like pork, so perhaps more flavoursome than chicken, but slightly lighter and more delicate than beef. So pork or veal would be wonderful.
Roger and Jean have just said partridge, and I think that would actually be lovely as well. Those sort of like lighter weight game birds, really nice.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, fabulous. Right, now I'm hungry.
I think we also had a bit of a vote between the two wines. And although I think I agree with those who are saying the Barolo is perhaps the standout winner of the pairing, there is a big price difference. We're talking about a new modern Etna style of fine wine against a fairly classic and aged Barolo from a great vintage and vineyard and producer. But I think that there's still incredible value in both. So I think not only will the Etna wine become more prized as we sort of see the next 10 years roll by, and we'll see the price continue to increase as demand increases. And I think it'll be worth it for the quality of wines being produced. But we will also see Barolo continue to go through the roof in terms of pricing, mainly because there's a huge gap in the market for fine wines at the moment, with the world selling out of Burgundy and looking for alternatives. And Piedmont and Barolos are definitely going to be one of those. So I think buying good vintages of Barolo Barbaresco now is a really good bet for very good drinking in 10 years' time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Just before we move on to the next wine, John's asked to describe the nose. Just to paraphrase Sarah, I think you said things like black tea, lots of red fruits, but that older red fruited, leather, I think was a great word you used, spice. So John,
Yeah, for the Barolo, definitely that kind of red apple, black tea spice. I think often we talk about rose and tar for Barolo, and it can be a little bit simplistic or a little bit mean. I'm not sure I ever really want to taste tar on anything, but rose is definitely, and Mosconi I think has more of those violets in the floral tones or the tea notes that we were talking about, and then that cherry red fruit flavor. Yeah, everyone said, somebody said, or Anne has said licorice. I think that's definitely the case. Fennel is often on lots of Italian fine wines as well, that kind of note of sweet spice.
Fabulous. Well, thank you, Sarah. I am conscious of the clock, but luckily it means that I can we can move on to our next pairing, which I'm equally excited about. Probably a bit more of a fair battle, I'd say, if you want to call it a battle. For members who are tasting along, we're going to do 4 and 3. So as a reminder, the Chianti and then the Brunello. So Sarah will open them and demonstrate, but for anyone who's needing to talk in advance, 4 and 3.
Number 4 we're doing next. I'm glad of your advice to have a pair of scissors. So
we watched Toby Morale. I wasn't hosting the event, but I must admit I enjoyed watching the recording of wine in places it shouldn't have gone. So we always say now, a pair of scissors. Very advisable.
So Chianti Classico. So I'm a huge Tuscan fan. I think Sangiovese, we often have this sort of perhaps a little futile debate around what's the king grape variety for Italy? Is it Nebbiolo or is it Sangiovese? I don't think there's really a debate in it. I think Nebbiolo is fabulous, but Sangiovese is the king of Italian red wine grapes. It's planted much more extensively. It's been famous for much longer. It makes a huge variety of styles. I think Tuscany is the home of Italian fine wine. I often sort of compare Tuscany to Bordeaux in a French sense, and Piedmont to Burgundy. And if I was in France, I would also claim that Cabernet was perhaps the king, which I know is even more controversial than this discovery. But perhaps it's a very old school wine education that I originally had, and I'd be delighted to continue to challenge that and drink lots of good Burgundy, Pinot Nebbiolo, Cabernet, and Sangiovese. But for me, Sangiovese is really what Italian red wines, fine red wines is all about, and has great potential. And I think that Chianti Classico, as one of the sub-regions of Chianti, has made some just astonishingly good wines over the last 4 or 5 years. It's an incredible region where the winemaking has dramatically improved in the last 20 years. There are now some incredible winemakers who are very dedicated to making the best thing that they can with often very old grape varieties or old grape vines that they have. Here is a producer that I've been following for a few years, but we were very lucky last year to start working directly with. And Michela and Vittorio, who really renovated this ancient Chianti Classico estate back in 1997, have made an incredible job of it. Again, if you're traveling, these guys also have a hotel with a swimming pool, so feel free to have a look at their website. It's in a beautiful area within Chianti Classico, and they have 15 hectares of Sangiovese vines. They also have a few of the other grape varieties that are common to the area, things like Colorino or Caniolo or Malvasia Nera, but this is 100% Sangiovese. They're farming organically, and they're aging the wine in old oak barrels for about 24 months. This is a Reserva. Reserva styles tend to have a little longer in oak before release. It's also had a few years in bottle now because this is a 2016 wine. 2016 was known as being a fantastic vintage across Italy, but especially in Tuscany and in Piedmont. And so finding 16 Reservas on the market today, I tend to immediately request a sample and see whether or not I can bring that in for members, because it's a vintage that I really think works. So I've seen some notes in the chat suggesting that there could be some cola on this. And I don't think that's a crazy tasting note. So it's that kind of, for me, it's got some of that sarsaparilla kind of flavor that can really come through, but also that kind of cherry note that is so classically Italian, maybe some balsamic notes as well here, because the wine is a little older and has started to really open up. It's got a rich flavor relative to the previous two wines. This is a fuller bodied style of wine. It's got that softness that comes with the tannins that are slightly sort of broader in their nature, although clearly still here. I think this is a very complex, fine wine, and I think actually for the price, this is what real value is. So perhaps, what do you think, Hannah?
I think it's fabulous. I agree on the cola, and sometimes when I get cola, I think of things like sort of those sweet spices, cinnamon, those sorts of smells as well, because I suppose cola has those in it, you know, it's made up of lemon peel and cinnamon and cola nuts and all sorts. So I think, I'm getting a bit of that, and I definitely agree on the cherry. And I have to say, I've had this conversation with you before, Sarah. Sometimes I find it easy to confuse Nebbiolo and Sangiovese if, you know, the styles are converging a little bit. For me, this is much more black fruited than the Nebbiolo was. It's got that kind of darkness to it, which I didn't see at all on the Nebbiolo. So it's actually fun for me to do these two next to each other as well.
No, I definitely agree. I think for me, often Sangiovese has that very cherry flavor, but it does then go into the black brie, black currant, plum sphere, rather than that kind of tartar, cranberry, red currant, and red berry kind of space that Nebbiolo really is. Still
got that beautiful classic Italian acidity though. I mean, the whole way through this tasting, I knew I was going to be hungry, but I'm only on wine 3 and I'm desperate for some pasta.
No, I'm really hoping my other half has got the oven on. But yes, no, it's going to be a hungry tasting. And I think when we're looking at food and wine here, it would be to follow through and to continue to be very boring in terms of what I suggest. But here it's hard to beat beef steak Florentina. So a T-bone steak, simply cooked with rosemary or olive oil, maybe a squeeze of lemon, but really good, really high quality steak with Chianti is, especially Chianti Reservas, is an absolute match made in heaven. Maybe a Sunday roast too, that kind of, nice slices of roast beef and good roast potatoes. That's the kind of thing this would work for.
You've just touched on it, Sarah. You've mentioned Reserva, and I was actually going to ask you about that. What does Reserva mean in Italy? It doesn't quite mean the same things in different countries. So in Italian wines, what does Reserva mean?
So it's complicated because Reserva doesn't quite have the same meaning even across different Italian regions. But here it means that the wine needs to be aged for a longer period. So within the sort of spectrum, it's the sort of one above the estate release. So the estate release for this house is the Chianti Classico, it's 2018, and we have that also in the online at the moment in the current offer. And then the 2016 is their Reserva that has been released later. It will have also been made from the slightly older or better vines and grapes that have come in. So there will have been a vineyard selection, although that isn't mandated, as well as then a barrel selection once it's sort of gone through first ferment to really make sure that they're picking out the best quality for their Reserva.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then we did have one great question as well from Samantha just before we do move on. Samantha had asked, how well and long will this age? And is this, or Chianti in general, as good an investment as you said for Barolo?
I think when I talk of investment, I definitely mean drinking investment. So for our future drinking enjoyability, I think Chianti is just as good an investment as Barolo. And I think you get to start at a price point that is even a little under Barolo at the moment. So it will be an easier thing to put in the cellar. I definitely have a case of this in my reserves. But I also have a case of the 2010 Barolo, or were we only allowed to buy 3 bottles? I'm now completely confused. But yes, so I have bought both of these for drinking. And I think they're going to be brilliant. And I think there are some producers that just you can't go wrong with in Chianti, you know, with the likes of Isabella Elena, Fontodi, you know, these guys. And I think people like Risk Ascoli, you know, there's just some Felsina, just it trips off the tongue. I've bought a lot of Chianti Classico in the last 18 months because I really believe in this style. I think this offers a really drinkable wine for everyday occasions, but also for special occasions and for the cellar at different price points. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you. So the answer is yes. Lovely. So just before we move on to the Brunello, I thought we'd somebody's mentioned in the chat about the pouches not keeping as well. What I would say is I've discovered a trick having done a few of these pouch sessions, and I'm annoyed I don't have one in front of me, but my pouches have fitted very well in my fridge door, and I would encourage you to pop them in your fridge door lined up. I line them up in order so I can give them another go tomorrow. Husband doesn't get any option of tasting them, they're mine, especially wines like this. I line them up in my fridge door, and then I'll pop something next to them to keep them up, an orange juice, a milk, or whatever it is. But in the opening door of the fridge, they're the perfect fit. And so if you do have any leftover members, I would encourage you to do that. They do keep well. Similarly, if you keep them in the fridge, just keep them 24, 48 hours, the same similar time you would as an open bottle of wine, because obviously the gas that was keeping them nice and safe is now gone. So just make sure that you consume them within 48 hours, but they do keep quite well. I certainly love doing these tastings on a Wednesday or a Thursday because it gives me something to go into my weekend with.
Although I think
my second least sloppy seconds ever.
I think we also tried to make sure the packs were reasonably generous so that they could be shared. So hopefully it may only be a small glass of each, but over the 6 wines, it ends up being a reasonable amount to consume.
Exactly. So Sarah, I'm ready for wine 3. I'm very, very excited about it, if you are.
Yeah, so I've just poured wine 3, which is the Brunello. This is from Constanzi, who are really incredibly well-respected and famous old producer dating back to the 15th century. Andrea, who's the current Constanzi involved in the production, has really sort of grown the company since he took over in 83. And one of his sort of big philosophies has been, I say it here in the note, but it's about finesse and elegance. And actually, Brunello, conversely, is known for being the wine of Tuscany that is a bit fuller. It's the hotter and drier region within the Tuscan sub-regions. So it's hotter and drier than Chianti Classico. And that usually creates wines with a fuller mouthfeel, slightly more fruit, and can be quite sort of alcoholic. However, Andrea has always really valued his vines at a slightly higher elevation, about 400 meters, just below the town of Montalcino. If you visited, it's a great tourist, beautiful medieval kind of walled town. And that gives this a lot more freshness. He also happens to have 25 hectares. He's only planted 12 to vines, or only has 12 hectares of vines. He then has 4 hectares of olives and 9 hectares of woodland. And the woodland is an interesting note because across Tuscany, lots of winemakers are talking to me about the importance of having forests and woodlands still close to their vines. So you can see here, a lot of his vines are surrounded by wood and more fallow land. And that definitely seems to pull more freshness in. It tends to retain more moisture. It's an area that will also increase the biodiversity in your vineyard. It can create a little bit more coolness, just in a very small microclimate way. And that's, I think, really helpful on his wine because he's making some of the more elegant styles of Brunello. Brunello over the last 20 years has also become incredibly popular, mainly driven by an American market. The American market, probably, whether or not it's true or not, but seemed to prefer styles that were fuller, more sweet, had a little bit more oak. And actually that's now started to be rolled back. So actually most Brunello producers who had followed that trend have started pulling back on the oak a bit. But here, Andrea never really needed to. He was always making quite an elegant style. He uses Slavonian oak casts and steel, so there's no new French oak on his Brunellos, and it's 100% Sangiovese. So hopefully now from 2013, this is actually from our museum bin. So unlike the Barolo, where I was able to buy an older vintage and sell it from the winery and direct from cellar and bring it out for members, here we bought the wine back in 2016 and we've been aging it for the last 6 years. Is that about right? Maths. And we've now released it to members because we think it's starting to really sing.
I have to say, Sarah, I'm amazed by the freshness. I think if you'd said blind, what year do you think that is? There is no way I would have gone that old. It has also, I must say, just sold out, because I know it wasn't sold out before. 5 minutes before we went online, I checked all the wines. So I suspect your description may have triggered a few happy fingers. I know it was fine just before we went online. I checked it myself. But a beautiful wine, and museum bins are special for that reason, aren't they? That ability for us to store them and then to release them at this point in time where they're just drinking beautifully.
I saw the sort of community thread and the talk around the worry that this might sell out, and I had anticipated actually selling it out last week, because releasing a wine like this, and because we're a cooperative, not maximizing the price that we could have put on it, has led to a really fantastic wine being available to members. And I am very sorry it sold out, but we do sell the same Brunello from the current vintage every year in our En Primeur campaign, and we will be doing that again, and we follow this producer very closely. So there is an opportunity there to follow this producer, because I really think they're making something very special.
Yeah, and buying it En Primeur, which is always lovely. Just quickly, we did have a member ask about a map, and Sarah, I've got a map actually from my intro to Tuscany last week, but just for a bit of geographical understanding, I'm going to flash it up because I think it's quite amazing how close these two places are.
Incredibly close, yeah. So it's about from the middle of Chianti Classico down to Montalcino is about an hour's drive. And so it's just down the road.
It's really amazing, isn't it? It's absolutely astonishing how
But the difference in rainfall is quite astonishing. So I think it's something like 200 millimeters. So it's a much drier region in Brunello.
Gosh. Yeah, it always astounds me the difference between those two. So I thought I'd throw it out there. Thank you for entertaining that. I've gone off piste.
No, not at all.
And then just flavour wise, just going over the flavours again of those two, what main differences would you be looking for on the aroma?
I think between the two at the moment, you're seeing, although there's a freshness to the Brunello that very much disguises its 2013 vintage, I think it is more spiced. So there seems to be a more black pepper note, or perhaps cloves, or those sorts of baking spices that come about. I don't think it's really in that leather spectrum yet. So I think there is, which often comes with tertiary development. So I think there is still a lot of time to go on the Brunello, whereas the Chianti is more about the fruit still. So it's much more on that. We were talking about cola and cherry and sarsaparilla. We're not finding those sweeter flavors in the 13 Brunello. It is drier as a fruit profile. Which again perhaps is slightly ironic given the two classifications. So Brunello often known for being a bit bigger and sweeter and fuller, but in these two vintages and in these two producers' hands, we've got very complex and different wines.
I think for me, the first wine has very fresh herbal notes, and the second wine, the Brunello, is that much more that dried herb character. I kind of want to have it at the second wine. I know we were going to touch on foods a bit during the whole course of the session, but for me that Brunello, I want to have a leg of lamb. I want to have it on the barbecue with pieces of rosemary sticking out and slightly smoked and charred and all of those sorts of things.
No, I think lamb is a perfect match for Brunello. So that, especially as you say, a little bit charred, like a bit more cutlets or something, with a bit more flavour and spice.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sarah. as a member has just said, Jane has said, really interesting to taste these side by side, and I couldn't agree more. A real treat. So thank
And then
you.
we move to our sort of last pair of the session, I guess, but we're going to wine number 1 next, aren't we?
Yes, so we're going sample number 1 and sample number 5 are our next pair.
Marvelous. And sample number 1 is the Taurasi. Let me open up. Gosh.
Which I only discovered recently, Sarah, that I've been saying wrong for nearly 10 years.
Oh, goodness. Or am I saying it wrong?
No, you're saying it right. Nobody's thought to correct me.
Well, you know, I think the moment or the sooner that we can all forgive ourselves for incorrectly pronouncing anything to do with something that we really love and want to get involved in, the sooner we'll start to enjoy it. Of course, pronunciation is important and language is important in a professional sense, but goodness, I really hope that with the Italian section I have, people just buy the wines and don't try and pronunciate some of the words that are on the labels and enjoy them.
Just give it a go.
We can really spend a lot of time getting upset about mispronunciation when we should be talking about the enjoyment of what's in the glass. I know that the winemakers that I work with would rather us say something incorrectly and enjoy their wine and everything they've worked so hard for. But Taurasi, so this is relatively new too. So we started working with Feuedi in just into lockdown. So in 2019, I visited and met Antonio, who's a wonderful owner of this estate, and it's one of the larger estates that that are sort of making these kind of wines in Campania. And he's a really you can see here he's a very gregarious kind of character. He's very good at making networks and connections. And we've been talking for a number of years about his wines and the opportunities that perhaps we had. And as we went into lockdown, we were actually in the process of getting the Taurasi set up. So I'm glad that it still went ahead despite all of the difficulties here. He isn't single, I'm afraid, Samantha. But no, he's definitely making a huge amount of an impact in this region. If you visit Naples, you will even notice that these guys have a wine bar in the airport. So they're very kind of on brand, as it were, and perhaps one of the larger producers in this lineup. Although they're not making a huge amount of the Taurasi, because of course it's still quite a fine wine. So this is 100% Aglianico. Oh, that's a beautiful photo. So yes, they're on this gorgeous volcanic site, just about 30 miles north of Naples, northeast of Naples. So visiting this region is a really beautiful thing to do, because Naples happens to be one of my favorite Italian cities. Definitely worth a revisit and a rethink around some of the stereotypical ideas we have of Naples. But Aglianico is the sort of red grape of choice in this neck of the woods, and it's definitely creating some of the finer red wines of the south. It has a real complexity when it's grown on very good soil types, and here we've got a very complex at altitude volcanic soil that we're tasting, and it can show those kind of terroir notes that you get. And so you can see the difference between single vineyard sites, which is also something you can see with Nerello Mascalese and Etna. And I think that for me is one of those real kind of notes around what makes a fine wine, or what makes a grape able to make a fine wine. And some of it is about showing real nuances of place. This has been it's been aged in barrels in French oak for 18 months. So it has a roundness, and it's also been held back for another 9 months in bottle. Because for the DOCG to be met for Taurasi, it must be held at the winery for at least 3 years before release.
I think this is the first of the wines, Sarah, where I have got that sort of sweet spice softening influence of oak, where I felt, it's, I guess, is it something also, I guess, grape variety, and it's a southerly region, right? So there is that warmth, perhaps, that's so far in our lineup. There's obviously a reason you've put this as the penultimate wine, but it's certainly a kind of warmer, richer, fuller wine. Those fruits taste a bit sweeter to me.
Yeah. No, I think a little bit like red grapes that have this, because I think we're also in a black fruit spectrum. I'm not sure if you're there too, but it's very black cherry and blackberry and black currant. Yes, there's some chocolate and some cocoa and some mocha. And I think wines that have that black fruit profile, grapes that have that, tend for me to work better alongside some of the oak flavors and notes that we're used to. A little bit like Cabernet, often in top level claret going into new French oak, almost 100%. Whereas here it's just a proportion of the oak barrels are new. Most of them are still old. So the oak here I think is quite well integrated, and it also complements rather than detracts from the wine. So there's a sort of quite nice sweetness that's sort of balancing out.
Yeah, I totally appreciate your black fruit and oak analogy. For me, sometimes those desserts that are more tiramisu, you dark fruit compotes tend to go quite well with vanilla-y, more chocolatey based desserts, those gateaux, Black Forest gateau type thing. So whenever I think of those black fruits and oak, those are the flavors that I get. Not the sweetness, they're not sweet wines, but certainly that spectrum of flavor.
I'm very sorry, because I think, Thomas, you might have some mushroomy notes on your wine, which I don't think is typical of the wine. I hope that there wasn't a problem with the sample, but
mine is certainly more licorice.
Yes, definitely licorice again. That sort of almost Pontefract cake type licorice, like very soft, dark, deep flavored licorice. Yeah, Anna's saying fig and prune. I definitely get those sort of notes. I think there's definitely more sort of what we think of as typically sweet. This is, of course, a very dry red wine, but those sweeter red fruits. So, yes, something that's a little bit dried or something that's a little bit more filling in the mouth. And, of course, we haven't talked about the tannins here. So we've got quite present tannins, but I think there's much more or fewer of them. It's a very naff or perhaps geeky thing to say, but I always used to qualify tannins as having both a structure and an amount, and so you can have a lot of fine tannins or a few, a very small amount of fine tannins, or the tannins could be angular, or they could be softening, or they could be gripping, or they could be drying. And I think this actually has quite big tannins, but there don't seem to be that many of them. They're sort of framing the wine, but not aggressive.
I agree completely. You're not, it's not that kind of overpowering tannin sensation. The levels are quite low, but their presence is definitely made known.
Yeah, and I think that's then going to really balance food matches here. So Aglianico, because it's from Campania, is often served up against lots of great pizzas, and I think it's not that I think a pizza is I don't think that you should not serve fine wine with pizza, because I've had some fantastic pizzas, but it's perhaps a little bit too simplistic as a pairing, really. And it would be better with things like lovely stews and richer, meatier dishes that'll work really well. But also cheeses are a great match with Aglianico because of that touch of sweetness. So it could go with some great Italian cheeses, things like Parmesan or other hard cheeses from Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. Fabulous. I'm conscious, Sarah, that lots of people will be very excited about our last wine. So I am conscious of time. So if it's all right with you, I would love to go on to number 5.
The last wine of the tasting. Okay.
Oh.
So I put these together because hopefully this is also quite a black fruited wine. I tend to think of Amarone as a little bit more black fruit flavored. This is Amarone made by a fairly large winery estate called Bertani, but it's a label within there called Tenuta Novare, which is a little bit of a project of their sort of consultant winemaker or full-time winemaker who spreads his time around the different estates that Bertani own, called Andrea Lenardi. And he's a really sort of inspiring winemaker character when you talk to him, because he thinks very deeply about how these wines should be made. And Amarone has a very classic style that is very popular and has been very traditional for a long time. And he's actually taking a little bit of a modern interpretation on that style of wine. So this is, I think it is very Amarone, and hopefully you will all recognize it, but I'll try and talk through what I mean by that. So Amarone is made from Corvina, which is the grape. It also makes Valpolicella, and Amarone is a style of wine that's been made in a really clever way to enhance the depth and the body that Valpolicella can have. So Valpolicella is often quite a light-bodied, red-fruited, almost Beaujolais-like red wine from northern Italy. But the Italians, especially in the north, knew that wines were more popular and sold better if they were a bit fuller, if they were sweeter, if they were bigger, if they were able to be a bit more intense. And to do that without blending in other grape varieties from perhaps other regions, which was a fairly common practice for a long time, they decided that instead they could dry the Valpolicella grapes, or the Corvina grapes. By drying them, they were reducing the amount of water that was going to be available, and so they were intensifying the flavors and intensifying the profile that you were going to achieve. And when it's fermented, of course, there's also a high level of sugar, so it's going to achieve quite high ABV. Here we're at 15.5, so please do be careful, everybody. I believe it's very, very well balanced and integrated, but it is the more alcoholic of the wines we're having tonight. And that sort of drying process and then making the wine from the more concentrated must is really at the heart of what Amarone is. Traditionally, they might have been aged in fairly large oak casks, and not really very well protected from oxygen. And so they would be aged for quite a long time to allow them to really come into balance. And it would be, they could be a little bit more balsamic or a little bit more rustic. Here in the sort of modern sense, Andrea is really trying to keep oxygen out. And so it's made in quite a reductive way, despite the drying process at the beginning. And it should be a little bit more lifted and a little brighter because of it. He's also trying to keep more of that acidity. And so although you're drying the grapes, you're drying them after harvest. You don't have to let them sit out on the vines and dry naturally on the vines. And so he's perhaps picking a little earlier to keep hold of that acidity.
I have to say that is, there's a few members saying what good value it is. And I couldn't agree more. You get a lot of wine for your money here, don't you? a lot of
really
wine.
do. And Amarone is a funny wine, because actually it's one of the Italian fine wines that's really great young. I think I really enjoy them at about 4 years old, as this is. They tend to have that lovely fruit profile, and they're already complex because of the way in which it's been made. So it's already got the layers of complexity. Very approachable. It's always the wines, at least that we buy for the Wine Society, I always try and make sure that they're extremely balanced, despite this quite overt style that they're made in. And I think they go brilliantly with food. So here is that kind of, this is where we're really into winter game stews, anything kind of full and rich, sausage and mash with a great gravy, or fantastic, game pie, or, more sort of cassoulet type dishes, duck, all of that sort of wonderful, full flavored red meats are going to be great for this. I'm sorry for those vegetarians on the call. I did start with a truffle and a risotto, but I seem to have sort of pushed most of my food pairings towards the meatier end.
I find Amarone is lovely with beetroot, roasted beetroots. So that's my favorite vegetarian food with Amarone. So I would often, if I was thinking of a veggie dish, do something almost as if you were going to put, dare I say it, a duck breast on top, but puy lentils, beetroot, some of those sort of rustic mixed with sweet. Does that make sense? Earthy and sweet combination foods, I think, work quite nicely. So puy lentil, something with some beetroot, and it would be on my agenda for this wine.
But what I think I really like about this too is that it's not fighting for the sort of oak side of things. So where you often have these sort of slightly bigger, sweeter wines with lots of this fruit flavor, you might have quite a big layer of oak. And here there isn't. It's sort of noticeably absent. And that's really allowing the sort of fruit to really sing and to take front stage. And of course, the fruit here is a little bit raisined, as the grapes were. So I think there's a bit of prune and there's a little bit of, almost dried blackcurrant or blackberry. I don't want to say jam because I think that's not fair on the wine. We often think of that as a negative note, but it's that fruit compote, summer fruit compote, or
sort of
sweet morello cherries, those kind of things that I really get here.
I have to say the greatest pairing I've ever had with an Amarone, I think I've told you about this one, Sarah, was in a wine bar in Rome. And I ordered by the glass in a sort of Coravani situation. It was the nicest wine on the menu. It's all I wanted, but I could only afford the glass. And with the glass, they brought me a big block of dark chocolate, and it was almost like a guillotine. And you just shaved off tiny, tiny slices of this sort of 85-90% cocoa chocolate. And it's only, to this day, it's the only chocolate and wine pairing where I've said, oh my goodness, I often find chocolate and wine pairings very interesting, but I'm never bowled over by them. And this was the pairing, but it was so fine. It wasn't a big chunk, very, very finely sliced, indulgent and decadent. I was speechless. It was delicious.
That sounds terrific.
More chocolate on guillotines. That's what I want.
But hopefully now you can see the reason for slightly altering every single wine's order, I'm afraid. Sorry about that planning. But I love the idea of having these in pairs that were more stylistically similar. And I think ending with these fuller, sweeter wines, and I mean, again, sweet not in terms of actual sugar level, but in their flavor profile, is a good way to go. So hopefully you don't mind. I put the Barolo at number 2 and moved everything around. But no,
it was absolutely fabulous.
What I also really hope with this tasting is to show that fine wine Italy is a really serious game. Like, I think these wines are really delicious, and so I don't mean to sort of be a party pooper on them. Because serious gets a bit sort of we must hold them up in a cellar and never drink them, or drink them only with reverence and the best food that we can possibly pull out in a special occasion. And I don't mean that, because I think these wines are for enjoyment and for they have an unpretentious nature about them. And I think the winemakers are making really exceptional wines with really great grapes that we don't see around the rest of the world. And I hope that this sort of group of 6 really sort of start to show that. And of course they show my bias towards Sangiovese, but I won't labor that, because I do drink an awful lot of everything else.
I think you're absolutely spot on there, Sarah, and you know, there's a nice range of prices in the Italian fine wine spectrum. So I think we ranged from 21 or 24 right through to the 65s, and within that spectrum there was quality at every price point. So if you're interested in dipping your toe into fine wine, then Italy is a pretty amazing place to start. So I will ask you one evil question, Sarah. If you could only save one half pouch, which half pouch would you be saving tonight?
Tonight. It's Anselmo's Barolo. Lovely. I think the Mosconi 2010, it blew me away last year. The sample I have tonight is exceptional. I think it's a stunning fine wine, and I'm looking forward to drinking the other half of the pouch as soon as this call's over. I've been very carefully spitting, but I won't be once the computer's off.
Fabulous. We did have a member ask about the voting. We decided not to vote just purely because of the order changes. We didn't want to confuse anyone. We would love to hear your favorites though, so please do write them in the chat. Or you're also going to receive an email, and this is very important, because the email is going to include the 10% discount for those who did purchase the packs. So members who were not aware, who are joining without a pack, you can in some of our events where wines are more available, not all of them, but if we do have a pack event, then we will be able to give you a 10% discount on wines that are still for sale. Tim is going to be sending that out, so please keep your eyes peeled. I believe it's going to come very, very early tomorrow morning for fairness. So please keep your eyes peeled for that, and that will give you 10% off all of the wines that are still for sale. 5 of 6 is not bad going, Sarah, considering we were a bit worried. But all I can say really is a huge thank you to Sarah for a fantastic evening. I've learned lots. I've truly enjoyed every single wine. So thank you very much for having me. And thank you, members, for your support. So I'll hand back to Sarah for a final farewell, but thank you for being our woman of the hour, Sarah, and for imparting
Yeah.
such knowledge.
No, well, thank you ever so much for hosting this kind of event. I really hope you all enjoyed trying the 6 different wines together. I think these pouches are a fantastic part of what we can now do. I know that they come with lots of different minute sort of problems around whether or not it's the style of the pouch or a little bottle, or should be a little jam jar or a larger bottle or a smaller something but I really think being able to get hold of this number of wines and see them in context is such a lovely idea. And to do it in our own homes, even though we don't have to anymore because, of course, lockdown is over, it's such a pleasure to be able to just stagger to the kitchen now. So I really hope all of you have got something in the oven and have a wonderful evening with these wines, and feel now that you're able to explore the offer a little bit more, and make sure you buy a few of your favorites. Thank you, Anna and Tim in the background, for hosting such a lovely event.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.